So what happened is, in practice, I asked Ming Ma and his colleagues, hey, what would you do if you had a lot more computing power? Not like 20% more or 2 times more, but like way more, like 100 times more or 1,000 times more computing power. And the first reaction was, well, sorry, Francois, but we don't think that's possible. And then, when I convinced them, I showed them the stats from World Community Grid, they said, well, we need to think. And actually, it's not obvious when you suddenly ask a scientist, what would you do if you had 10 or 100 times better tools than you already have, right? Like the analogy I would give is it's a bit like Galileo. If you asked him, what will you see through the telescope before he looked, right? It's not obvious what they're going to do. But after discussing this for a while, we came up with a research plan that we thought would be pretty convincing, and then we got in touch with World Community Grid.
And the research plan was definitely very compelling for us. Maybe you can explain how you were going to approach your research and what you were hoping to get out of this research effort.
Sure. So what we thought was important, what we could do with so much more computing power, was really get to grips with how the water is flowing in practice in these filters. You see, the research that had been done up to then using simulations, basically the scientists used a trick. So in the simulations, you can normally only simulate a very short period of time, like less than a nanosecond, less than a billionth of a second of the water flowing through. And in order to see the water doing anything in such a short time, the trick is to speed up the water flow to a very high rate, like 100 or 1,000 times more than in a real filter. And then in that short nanosecond, you can still see something happening. And so you're taking a sort of extreme example in order to be able to detect some measurable results in the simulations. So that's okay. You can kind of extrapolate from these very high speeds down to the realistic speeds of water flow in filters. But extrapolation is sort of linear, and you could ask yourself, well, maybe something's going on at these lower speeds that doesn't turn up at high speeds, so it might be worth doing the simulations at these much lower speeds and seeing what's out there. So it was really a bit of a shot in the dark. Just like Galileo, so I just put this up to remind you, I mean, Galileo started to look through the telescope at Saturn, and he didn't know what was going on. He saw these, weird things next to Saturn. He thought it was maybe ears or something on Saturn. Turns out Saturn's rings, he was starting to resolve them with the telescope. So from our point of view, it was the same sort of shot in the dark. Let's see what goes on at these low speeds. Does water really flow the same, or is there something new out there? If there is something new going on, it's bound to be important because it's happening under the realistic conditions that are relevant in filters.
I think you can see why this was compelling for us to get involved. But Francois, maybe you can talk about the early days of the project and sort of your early findings.
Right. So, well, first of all, we pitched all this idea to IBM, and you have a process of selecting, which is, you have external reviewers, and luckily we were selected, and we were very glad. So then this world community thing gets going, and, people like Gerard and hundreds of thousands start processing data for us, and like in a period of weeks, we had more data than this team at Tsinghua had managed to gather in 2 years. And I remember Ming Ma's eyes was like boggled, like, wow, this is amazing. And, the servers were filling up with data at a great rate. And, it didn't take long before we started to discern in the data that was coming back something new, something unexpected. And so, that was sort of confirming that it really had been worth looking with this much more powerful system. Well, as scientists, we're sort of trained to be skeptical. So when you get weird and wonderful results, your first reaction is, I did something wrong, right? So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what we were doing wrong. And we repeated the simulations under different conditions with different sizes of nanotubes and so on. And we also, at the same time, we reached out to experts we knew in the field. We started collaborating with a group in Israel at the University of Tel Aviv, with a group in London at University College London, in Australia, groups at Monash University and at Sydney. They all brought to this problem their own expertise and thoughts and insights. And we really spent a lot of time making sure and double sure that this was a real effect. And the conclusion was, yes, this is, this hadn't been seen before, but these phonons, these vibrations, were really coupling and having a big effect on water flow.